Hello, my name is Brendan. Welcome to From Balcony Bridge to Winterdale Arch, crossing Central Park, this special members walk. I'm going to adjust this. I'm trying to get the perfect light so I look angelic and also you can see my face. We'll see how that works. The first thing I want to say is that we're so sorry if you tried to get into the walk earlier and were unable to. If you had trouble with the link, we're still trying to figure out these virtual programs just like everyone else. And so we're so glad that you're able to join us today. On today's program, we're going to explore just 10 of the over 30 bridges and arches that are scattered throughout Central Park. We'll talk about why they were built, we'll listen to some of the stories behind them, and also talk about how the Conservancy cares for them. We're going to be together for maybe 45 minutes or so. And if you have questions during this time, I'm going to encourage you to use the Q&A feature, which you can find on your Zoom control bar. I've got two colleagues, Ryan and Ian. They're on this program as well, and they're going to be answering your questions from the back end. If you just want to say hi or comment or share a story, please, you're welcome to use the chat feature to do that. All participants are muted, and so those are your two best options. The last thing I want to say before we get ourselves started is just thank you. You're going to see that Central Park the Conservancy has touched every single bridge and arch within the park. Over the last 40 years, we've done restorations of landscapes surrounding these bridges and arches. We've restored the bridges and arches themselves. Some of them we've basically reinvented and recreated. And it's really with the support of the Central Park Conservancy members that we are able to do that. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Also, the Zoom background I'm using isn't a real background. It's the mall, historically. So if my face suddenly disappears, it's the Zoom background's fault. I didn't go anywhere. Okay, let's go ahead and begin. So the first thing I want to do is just walk through kind of how this program is going to work. We're going to explore 10 of the over 30 bridges and arches. And the beauty of virtual programs is we get to just go wherever we want. We're not limited by geography. So we're going to go all throughout Central Park. And we broke this program up into 5 different categories. We have transverse roads, cast iron, decorative bridges that connect to the landscape, rustic stone bridges, and then also we're going to explore some bridges and arches that aren't here anymore. And you can see on the map on the left side of your screen, all the various red dots are the spaces that we're going to go. I'll show you the map again before we get to these various bridges so you can try to place yourself within Central Park. Before we go any further, though, I want to go ahead and launch one of our polls. And the polls that you're going to see pop up on your screen, you're going to have a chance to vote on them. And they help us learn a little bit more about what you're thinking and also about you. So the first poll actually is just learning a little bit more about how long you've been a member with the Central Park Conservancy. So if you wouldn't mind just going ahead and voting for me, you should see a poll pop up on your screen right now. It looks like votes are coming in. Once everyone has voted, I'll go ahead and share and we'll see who's with us today. Okay. Now, Central Park today has roughly 31 ornamental bridges and archways, but that doesn't actually include the 14 bridges that go over the transverse roads and the numerous kind of smaller rustic wooden bridges that you can see in some of our woodlands. At Central Park's peak, there were 39 bridges and arches. A few of those have been demolished. But interestingly enough, when Central Park was originally planned, there were only 7 bridges, 2 tunnels, and then 2 other footbridges. So it's pretty interesting to think about how the original founders, or designers, excuse me, had this idea for the park. And there were some bridges, some arches, but by the end of it, there were tons more. So to start out, we're actually going to talk a little bit about why that is, how these bridges and arches came to be. And we're going to need 2 pieces of terminology to do that. So the left side of your screen, you're seeing the inside of a bridge, and there's a stone block of stones, a little stone wall that's holding up that bridge. That's called an abutment. An abutment is where the bridge connects into the stone or into the land. On the right side, you're seeing that triangular portion of this cast iron bridge, and it's really decorative. It has these wisps and flowers. That's called a spandrel. So abutments and spandrels. We're going to come back to those words as we go through this presentation. And who are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about these three gentlemen. So on the far left, you have Frederick Law Olmsted. In the middle, you have Calvert Vaux. These two gentlemen are often thought of as the founders of Central Park. They were the main designers. They created the Greensward Plan. But we can't talk about bridges and arches without including Jacob Ray Mould, who you'll see on the far right. And actually, the bridges and arches, they're really the product of Vaux and Mould. They were architects. Jacob Ray Mould did a lot of the ornamentation and designs all across Central Park. And even though Frederick Law Olmsted was this grand visionary, he really thought about the landscapes and the synergy of everything. And so we're going to really focus on Vaux and Mould today and give Mould some praise. He's sometimes left out, actually, of the grander narrative. Now, remember how I said that the original plan only had 7 bridges, 2 tunnels, and 2 additional footbridges? And then at the park's peak, we had 39? Well, here's kind of the reason why that is. So what you're seeing in here is actually just a section, the lower section of the park in a map from the 1870s. It's really beautiful. It's really detailed, really decorative. And what I want to highlight here is that Olmsted and Vaux weren't actually all powerful. You know, sometimes we think about the Greensward Plan and then boom, we had Central Park. But there was a lot of other people in the mix. And those people were part of the board of commissioners who oversaw this whole park design. They had a lot of requirements. They not only put down kind of 8 main design requirements that all the park submissions had to adhere to, but there were other things. There were debates and negotiations. There were give and take after the Greensward Plan was already put forward. And so there were 2 commissioners, and that's Robert Dillon and August Belmont, 2 of many. They were both bankers, and they were both horse enthusiasts, as you'll say. Belmont, you might know it from Belmont Stakes, which is one of our huge horse races here in the United States. And when they saw the original Greensward Plan, they said, this is cool. It's very natural. It's very rural. They said it might be jarring for people to leave an incredible urban landscape and then walk into this really naturalistic space. They also said there wasn't enough ways for the public to engage with the park, meaning there weren't enough paths. People might be stuck on the perimeter, or they might be walking along the main drive because there were huge sidewalks that were planned for either side of that. And they also said the bridle path for the horses wasn't long enough. So this is the bridle path today. It goes around the reservoir. Originally, that was all that Olmsted and Vaux proposed, was just around the reservoir. They really publicly fought for the bridle path to be extended. And you can see it trace all the way down. That would be the west side of the park. And it ends at the south or the southwest side. But originally it actually ended at the southeast side. It continued all the way to to Grand Army Plaza. And that part of the bridle path was destroyed in the 1930s, and we'll talk more about that. But they also said, we need more paths. We want paths for people to ride on, paths for people to drive on, paths for people to walk on. And so that proposal, Olmsted and Vaux took it and they ran with it. And they created this incredible array of ornamental bridges made of polychromatic brick and cast iron and stone quarried from the earth, imported stone. And so even though one of the things that Olmsted and Vaux are really known for is the separation of grade, the opportunity for someone to walk all the way through the park without having to cross a carriage path or a bridle path, without this public outcry, we might say, from these 2 commissioners, the park might look very different. But today we're focusing on what actually happened, these other arches and bridges that were created. And so to start, we're going to talk about some of the most important that actually are not visible. So I want to share a little bit about the transverse roads. Now, these aren't technically ornamental arches and bridges. In fact, they're very utilitarian. You can see we've got 4 of them, and these were originally planned in the park. You had to have these transverse roads. The reason being, the commissioners were concerned if we put this humongous park in the middle of Manhattan, how are people going to get from the west side to the east side and vice versa? And so Olmsted and Vaux actually ingeniously sunk these roads underneath the park. And you can see on the right side, this is a stereographic image. That's why there's two of them right next to each other. You would actually put this little image into a stereograph or stereo viewer. And when you look through it, you would be able to see it in 3D. We still use them today, but today they're usually little and red and plastic, and they have a little wheel. But you can see that this transverse road sunk in, and this is the 79th Street traverse, because you can see the old reservoir on the left side of your screen. Now, here's the rationale for those transverse roads. Not only did Olmsted and Vaux rationale, they were like, great, we'll put these roads that cross the park. They sunk theirs because the fear was that if we put these roads that cross the park, we're going to have horse-drawn carriages and workers and people moving their animals and kind of the rabble of New York. Moving right through this naturalistic landscape. So by sinking these, we then were able to keep the park really this whole naturalistic place. And inside of this image from the 1860s, you can see some of that justification. And it makes me wonder, and actually you're welcome to comment in the chat if you have an idea, what would have happened if the transverse roads would not have been created? How do you think that would have changed the development of New York City? I don't know. Here's another picture of a transverse. This one is the 66th Street, and this one is the first one that was finished. And this really gives evidence as to one of the other reasons that the transverse are so cool. Not only do they go underneath, but you're never supposed to see them. And Olmsted and Vaux planned this greenery all around them to hide them and to hide a lot of the noise. So even today, as you're walking through the park, there's many places that you might be crossing over cars and not even know it. And these are actually big enough that double-decker buses can go under them. There was a lot of foresight that was put in here. The DOT, Department of Transportation, they inspect these because they're technically part of their purview. But it's also worth noting, the Central Park Conservancy, we are everywhere. We close the transverse once a year, give or take, to clean them. So really early in the morning, we close them and then move through to make sure that we pick up any garbage and any other things that we might need to remove. So even down here in this roadway that sometimes we forget about and don't even really think about as Central Park, the Central Park Conservancy is a part of that as well. Okay. Before we move on to cast iron, let's see who we have with us. Where are my polls? There they are. And all right. So it looks like we have about 68 people here with us today. We have a ton of members who've been with us over 10 years, which is incredible. And thank you so much for that continued support. A lot of the projects that we're going to talk about today, you very well might have been a part of in that way. For those of you who've been here 5 to 10, 3 to 5, thank you. For our newer members, we're so happy you're here. And we're really hopeful that we're going to be able to provide more opportunities like this so you can learn about this incredible park that you are so generously a part of. All right. Cast iron. The cast iron bridges in Central Park, these are some of the most famous in many, many ways. You can see we're going to talk about 3 of them, and they're on the left side of your screen. One is at the southwest corner, and then the other 2 are along the reservoir. I'm going to say something shocking. We're not going to talk about Bow Bridge, which is one of the most famous cast iron bridges, not only in Central Park, but in the world. After we did this the last time, we had someone who asked why, and it's a very valid question. Bow Bridge is very popular, and we wanted to highlight some of perhaps the lesser known bridges in the park. But it's worth noting that Bow Bridge is the second cast iron bridge in the United States. The first one is in Brownsville, Pennsylvania. And so without it, these other bridges, they might have not necessarily come to fruition. But there were originally 7 cast iron bridges in the park. And the reason that cast iron is so monumental is because it was actually fairly new to the United States. It started in the 1770s in London, and there was a cast iron bridge that was created. Eventually moves to America in the 1850s with that bridge in Pennsylvania, in Brownsville, Pennsylvania. And then it comes to New York, 1862 Bow Bridge, followed by many of these other bridges that are going to be created right around that same time. The cast iron boom continues. We see it all over New York City. It's on facades of buildings. It's in other bridges. And the reason that it was so popular is because it's really easy to manipulate. So you can make things really ornate and really decorative. The cast iron bridge that we're looking at is Pine Bank Arch. And you can see that the abutment for one side is literally the Manhattan mica schist that is all over the park. Now, as you'll see in this art or this image, you can see Pine Bank crossing over what the bridle trail. And with this extension of the bridle trail by Dillon and Belmont, or that push for it, you had to have additional arches to cross over because you didn't want people having to dodge horses or horses having to dodge people. Belmont was a huge proponent of going very fast on a horse. So he wanted to make sure that it was uninterrupted. This is at the southern end of the park. As I mentioned, it was actually built in the early 1860s, and it's part of the bridle trail that extended from 59th to 5th Avenue. Actually, when the bridle trail was destroyed in the 1930s by Robert Moses, it ended right here at Pine Bank. But for the longest time, it was kind of an amorphous ending. And so the Central Park Conservancy the Central Park Conservancy in 2006, we restored the landscape, and we actually created this cul-de-sac that you see to make it a horse turnaround. So it went from being a completely ornamental bridge with the purpose was simply to look at because horses weren't going underneath, back to a very functional bridge that goes over the bridle trail. Moving forward, let's talk about two other bridges that go over the bridle trail. Now, these two were going to be original because the bridle trail originally expanded around the reservoir. And so we're going to start at the northern end, and then we'll go to the southern end. This is one of the more famous bridges in the park. This is Gothic Arch. I keep saying bridge and arch, and one thing that's really interesting is that technically a bridge goes over water and an arch goes over land. But that design or that naming convention doesn't fit in Central Park. Sometimes bridges go over land and water, arches go over land and water. The Gothic Arch, or bridge number 28. Every bridge in Central Park had a number. They actually started with numbers. They didn't start with names. And eventually they were named because it was far easier for the commissioners and people who worked in the park to understand and kind of connect with them. The same thing goes for the entrances. All the entrances of Central Park originally had numbers, and then were eventually named Merchants Gate and Farmers Gate and things like that. So this is bridge number 28. Bow Bridge is number 5, technically. And this is on the northern end of the 106-acre reservoir. It derives its name from the kind of middle-age Gothic architecture that you can see, especially with these corner spandrels, with that decorative nature. Now, here's a historic image of Gothic Bridge, also a really great way to see this kind of separation of grade. So these horses able to move through the bridge with the people able to go over. Today, the bridge connects to the Stephanie and Fred Schumann running track around the Jackie Onassis Reservoir. Here's a closer look at those spandrels. They're really beautiful, and they make the bridge almost look very light, kind of these thin spandrels that connect top to bottom. It's deceptive because bridges are very heavy, especially cast iron. Even though it's easy to manipulate, it's not a light material. Another aspect of the cast iron that was really popular, Olmsted and Vaux specifically wasn't necessarily a huge fan of cast iron. There was a lot of potential here, but he thought that it didn't look natural. And a lot of the commissioners said we should use it simply because of that reason, because it looks modern. We want the park to be modern and updated. And there was a little bit of a fight back and forth, but one of the reasons that we have these cast iron bridges is because they were far less expensive to build than some of the larger stone bridges, especially with the imported stone. The next cast iron bridge that I want to share is number 24. So this is the southern end of the reservoir, also along the bridle trail. And it's really quite beautiful. It's one of the three unnamed bridges. It doesn't have a co-name. And its story is very similar to bridge number 28. It was built to help people get from the pathway to the reservoir, to walk around and promenade, and help make sure they dodge the horses that were going to be going underneath. Here is a detail of the spandrel. It has this really stunning flower pattern, and just like Gothic bridge or Gothic arch, it extends out this vine that makes it look really, really delicate. Another aspect of Bridge 24 that's quite special is that Bridge 24 is a part of Gilder Run. And that's named after Richard Gilder, whose love of Central Park was really influential in the initial creation of the Central Park Conservancy in 1980. Here's an image of Mr. Gilder. The building you're seeing in the back there is one of the gatehouses of the reservoir. Mr. Gilder with the first president of the Conservancy, Betsy Barlow Rogers. And on the right side, you can actually see some of the plaques or the stones that you can get engraved to honor a loved one and have someone's memory really live on. Mr. Gilder was an avid runner. He ran around the running track for many, many years. And so it's really fitting that Gilder Run is here, and also that this is a space where more people can honor their loved ones for years to come. Mr. Gilder died in May, hence highlighting him now, and we are very, very thankful for all of his work. Okay, so section 3. We're going to talk about 3 of the naturalistic stone bridges in the park, because they also have a very cool story. It's also really fitting that we went from cast iron to stone, because Gapstow Bridge, which is the bridge that you see in this image, is both, depending on the year that you're looking at. Now, we're going to talk about Gapstow, Huddlestone Arch, and then Glenspan Arch. And as I said, there was a lot of discussion about building material when the park was created. Some of the arches were built out of imported stone, like brick and bluestone and marble, which is very expensive. Some of them were made out of polychromatic brick, meaning red brick and yellow brick, which we'll actually see in a bit, which wasn't popular with all the commissioners. And also the money ran low. The Central Park famously went very, very over budget very early on. And so finding a way to build bridges cheaper was some of the impetus for these rustic stone bridges. But Gapstow Bridge didn't start out as a rustic stone bridge. This is the original Gapstow. Cast iron, wooden, and stone. It's pretty incredible when you look at this really beautiful suspension bridge, and it was really decorative and very ornamental. And it's very hard to see, but in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, it actually says estimated cost $8,000, which it feels cheap, but is very expensive. Now, this was built in 1873. It was suggested by Olmsted and Vaux, but interestingly enough, again, the park was constructed, or excuse me, 1874. The park was finished in 1873. It was said to be finished. All the main kind of design and landscape elements had been created. And there were additional bridges that had to be created in the 1870s to deal with the incredible amounts of people who were coming to Central Park. They realized that the bridges were not substantial enough, the pathways and bridges. And so this helped people get to the promontory, which is now the Hallett Nature Sanctuary at the southern end. It endured for about 20 years. And at the end of 20 years, the wood had started to rot, and it didn't make sense to recreate it. They needed to make it, or excuse me, to repair it. They needed to do something that would last a little bit longer. And so, oh, excuse me, here's a historic image of Gapstow. So that gets you an opportunity to see in real time what this suspension bridge looked like. Regardless of the historic image, I love looking at them because you can see how short the trees are. And I just think about how the park would have felt so different when the trees were not as tall and towering as they are today. Here is current Gapstow. So current Gapstow was made in 1896. It's out of Manhattan mica schist, so it's out of stone quarried from the park, and it was created not by Olmsted, not by Vaux, not by Mold. It was created by the firm of Howard and Codwell, and so a different architectural firm built it, but it still follows that same design aesthetic. It's really natural and it connects really well to the landscape. As we move forward in the warmer months, and even now in the summer, the vines start to cover this and really drape over it. It's quite beautiful, and it looks very, very rustic and almost like a ruin that you might find covered in vines. I'm curious if you have a preference. So I want to launch another poll and see if you prefer the original Gapstow or the new Gapstow today, the one with the stone. So the cast iron one or the in wood one or the one with the stone. We'll share these results in a little bit. Let's continue. We're going to go all the way to the other end of the park to see some more of these stone bridges. This is Huddlestone Arch. Huddlestone is an incredible feat of engineering, and it is one of the two entrances to the North Woods. The other is Glenspan, which we'll talk about in a moment. It's constructed in 1866 out of stone that was pulled from the park. Now, Vaux specifically said to his workers, I want you to find rocks that look jagged and irregular. He wanted to give the illusion after this arch was finished that it wasn't built by man, that it kind of tumbled this way. And the aspect of it that is so cool is A, it was cheaper to produce, which is crazy to think because it's this incredible feat of engineering. But B, there's no mortar. It is held up by gravity and friction. And additionally, a very strategically placed keystone, which traditionally arches have. Now, if we go underneath the arch, we can see the stones kind of quote, quote, huddling together. And that is indeed how Huddlestone got its name. As I said, the arch uses no mortar. So the fact that these stones are huddling together and none of them are just popping out is pretty incredible. And even though it sounds really precarious, this arch has been holding up carriages and cars since it was built in 1866. So it's obviously not going anywhere. Now, the little stream that you see on the right is part of the lock, which travels all the way through the North Woods. Now, I also want to show you this boulder. Again, Vaux sent out people to find irregular shaped rocks that looked like they'd just been pulled from the earth. This boulder is a great example of it. Some of the rocks inside of Huddlestone weigh over 100 tons. So it's incredible to think about people pre-mechanized cranes putting together an arch like this. Glenspan, on the other side of the North Woods, is also made of stone, but it looks very, very different than Huddlestone. This is not Glenspan today. This is the original Glenspan. So as you're seeing, we have this kind of stone base, and then we have wooden trestles that go with a wooden walkway all the way. The rustic wooden trestle that you see is very in line with Vaux's ideas about bridges in the park. He wanted things to look rustic and naturalistic. The vehicular drive, or the carriage drive, is what's above this. And then there's a promenade that you're going to see that would go right through, also with the lock. It was finished in 1865, and the stone is called gneiss, so it is not Manhattan mica schist. Let's see. The nooks. So someone asked this question during the last walk, and we looked into it. You can see there's a little nook. You can probably see my cursor on either side of this stereographic image, and that nook once held a bench. But on the other side, there is what's called a grotto. You can't see it in this image, but the grotto is a deeper nook, and that was designed that way. Originally, it was put there because it looked cool. In the 1860s, there was this design aesthetic of trying to make things look old, like ruins, like ancient Greece, ancient Rome, overgrown, just stumbled upon. And so those archways were part of that idea of making things look like ancient times. To access Glinspan, you walk down this kind of pathway past the cascade, or a cascade that moves the water from the pool into the loch. And that rushing water really drowns out some of the city noise that you might hear around that time. And it makes you feel like the built environment disappears and you truly are in the woods and the Adirondacks. Now, I mentioned that the Central Park Conservancy has restored the bridges and the landscapes. We saw the restoration of the Pine Bank landscape. We also restored the cascade in this area as well in 1992. It was a $300,000 restoration project, and it also revitalized Glinspan Arch and this whole surrounding landscape. The restoration included moving some of the silt from the basin, adding new plantings, reshuffling rocks if any of them had fallen, and there was also a rustic wooden bench that sits above this area as well. Excuse me, bridge, not bench. Okay, we're moving right along. We have gone through this to the south, to the north, to the south, to the mid, to the north, to the south. We're going to the mid again-ish, the south mid, and two bridges. Olmsted and Vaux, I say their names together just instinctively, Vaux and Mold, they were thinking about these bridges fitting in with the landscape. Some of them did that aesthetically. The Huddlestone Arch, Glinspan Arch, they wanted people to kind of stumble upon them, feel like they're natural, but there were other bridges that fit into the landscape, not aesthetically, but functionally. And there's two of them that I want to talk about. The first one is the one that you see here. So this is Balcony Bridge. Now, Balcony Bridge was created in 1860. It's at the north end of the lake on the west side, created out of Manhattan mica schist from the park, but also a stone called mountain graywack. It looks like graywacky. Sometimes you hear people say graywacky. If you Google pronunciation, all the videos say graywack, so you can live whatever life you feel is best. Graywack is a sandstone that's characterized by its hardness and its color. Now, this is the historic picture of it, quite obviously. And the reason that Balcony Bridge is so connected to the landscape is because of its function. So in this image, we have ice skaters. Now, the lake was the first part of Central Park to be created, the first landscape, excuse me. It was opened in 1858, and it was opened quickly because of ice skating. One of the design requirements of Central Park was to have this skating pond. And you have all these people who've obviously flocked to Central Park to go ice skating. This is a Currier and Ives lithograph. In the back of it, you can see Bow Bridge. So there's our famous Bow Bridge. And you could stare at this image all day and find something new every time. Now, bottom right-hand corner, there's a dog. There's a lady on an ice chair being pushed by a man. In the direct middle, you have this man in yellow, and he's sitting on his on the ice because I would assume he's obviously fallen over, which would be me. On the far left side, you have a little group of people, looks like a little boy or a little girl in orange, and a man putting on a woman's ice skate. Ice skating was a co-ed opportunity. So you could skate with your bow, and you could hold hands, which morally was a little bit iffy at the time. But there was also a place for single women to skate. Single women to skate without the prying eyes, perhaps, of gentlemen. And that was the ladies' pond, which was on the other side of Balcony Bridge. Now, here's a balcony that gives Balcony Bridge its name. And you'll notice that this balcony with this bench looks out over the lake. So if you imagine 1858, say you don't like to ice skate, like I don't like to ice skate. I think that ice skates hurt my ankles. I would be up here. I would be sitting on this little bench watching the skaters frolic. The ladies, on the other hand, would be at Ladies Pond. And as you can see from this image, this is the other side of Balcony Bridge. You don't have any balconies. There's no way for people to really comfortably look out over Ladies Pond. So you can see Balcony Bridge. It's one of those bridges that's really connected to the landscape by function, which is, it's a pretty cool aspect of this bridge. And also today it's pretty cool. This is no longer a pond. It was filled in many years ago. It is a place, though, that sometimes gets a little marshy, especially in the rain, and it's a popular spot for birders. This is a spot that birds like to congregate. And as we know, Central Park is a prime birding location, one of the best in the United States, with 280 species that have made their way through, especially during those peak migration seasons, one of which we're just wrapping up now. Now, considering ice skating happens in the winter, the next arch that I want to talk about is very fitting. This is Winterdale. Winterdale Arch is on Winter Drive. You can see here, it obviously crosses the bridle path because you can see the horses, and then there's a pedestrian pathway that's on the other side of it. Those two pathways, it's a lot of space that this arch has to span, and Winterdale Arch actually has the largest brick span of any of the brick ornamental arches in the park. It was created in 1862, and above it is main carriage traffic. Now here is Winterdale today. So you can see that it is made out of two different types of stone. You have this white brick, and then there's red brick inside. It's Pennsylvania red and Milwaukee white. And it's a really key feature of Winter Drive, as I mentioned. And Winter Drive, which runs roughly 72nd to 102nd, was originally created by Olmsted to flourish in the winter. There were conifers planted, and it was supposed to be a place that really promoted sleigh rides, excuse me. It promoted sleigh rides to go to be in a sleigh, being pulled by horses, moving through this incredible winter paradise. Over the years, those trees died, and they were replaced by deciduous trees. So the winter vibe became less connected to the arch and the landscape. Now in 1983, we restored Winterdale. We added the railings up at the top during that restoration, which had been missing for about 50 years or so. Here's Winterdale in its element, so in the winter. Now the Conservancy's actually been putting coniferous trees back on Winter Drive. So slowly, as either trees die or we need to put new ones in, we are recreating this winter vibe. And it's one of the ways that the Conservancy really holds true to the original vision of Olmsted and Vaux. We modernize Central Park for the times, but also want to recognize that Central Park is a respite from urban life. And what better way to do that than to be able to walk through this really beautiful winter landscape. Massive sleigh rides, we don't see those anymore. They're not great for the turf. Even in the summer though, Winterdale is still winter-y. Here's an opportunity to see that polychromatic brickwork, and I think it looks like little snowflakes, personally. All right, so let's see, now that we've seen these decorative stone bridges, let's go back to our poll. And it looks like the 33% prefer the original structure and 67% prefer the current structure. I know that preference is super subjective, and probably we love both structures equally. I gave you a binary here. But it's really exciting to kind of think about how Central Park has changed over the course of the years. Okay, stop this, and let's go ahead and continue our program. Now I want to talk about two arches that are no longer here. We're going to talk about one that was on Center Drive, just at the south end of the mall, above the dairy. You'll see that big red dot. And another one that was at the south end of what is today Heckscher Playground. We're going to talk about Marble Arch and Spur Rock Arch. This is Marble Arch. Now, Marble Arch was constructed in 1860. As I said, sat at the south end of the mall. It separated the carriage drive from the pedestrian path. And if you think about, if you've visited Central Park and you've walked the intersection from the dairy to the mall, especially in the summer with carriages and bikers and pedicabs, it's very busy. Sometimes you kind of have to look both ways, close your eyes and run. Marble Arch would be an incredible feature to have today. It's called Marble Arch because obviously it was built of marble, super expensive, the only arch or bridge in the park that was built of marble. And it would have taken you underneath the carriage drive or the drive and up sort of around where Christopher Columbus is today. Within the arch, you had these nooks for sitting that were also made of marble. Some really decorative carvings. And there was also one of the park's original 27 drinking fountains within this arch. What you're seeing here is a group of people standing in the back, and then all that light is because you would have the stairs coming down on either side at that place. Now, the reason Marble Arch is no longer here is during the 1930s, and all the bridges that were removed from Central Park were removed during this time by the Robert Moses administration. He changed the course of the drive to make it more easy for cars to move around, and therefore he needed to get rid of Marble Arch in the process. It's a shame. This is a beautiful, beautiful structure. Now, the next one is this one. It's a cast iron, so it mirrors Pine Bank and Gothic and bridge number 24. It was on the bridle path, and the arch was set into a spur of Manhattan mica schist, sort of like Pine Bank. And so that is how the arch got its name. Sat right about 7th and 61st. Now, if you go to 7th and 61st today, you're going to be at Heckscher Playground, and that's why this arch is no longer there. The Moses administration expanded Heckscher Playground, and to do that, they took this arch down. Feasibly, they could have kept it in the play space, but it had deteriorated. It would have taken a lot of restoration to take it back up to what it was. That was the Great Depression, and large restoration projects of ornamental cast iron bridges from the 1860s were not high on the list of things to do. So with the destruction of the bridle path, we also saw the destruction of this arch. You can see the spandrels have that really beautiful decorative wheel in them, which is quite pretty. The Conservancy has touched every arch, every bridge, be they rustic and wooden or huge and stone. I want to go through one of the restoration projects that we did quite recently that really highlights all the work that we do in a really big way. So I want to share about Oak Bridge. Oak Bridge is just at the northern tip of the lake. You can see the red dot on your map there. And it is a connection to the Ramble. Oak Bridge was originally created of wood, but had these white oak inserts, which is where it got its name. Designed by Calvert Vaux and Jacob Ray Mold, it was actually one of the more elegant wooden bridges that we had in the park. And it also had decorative cast iron that was set into those railings. By the 1930s, we keep going back to the 1930s, Oak Bridge had deteriorated quite significantly, and it was actually removed and a utilitarian footbridge was added. Here is historic Oak Bridge, again, an opportunity to see the Ramble in its kind of true state. The Ramble was created as a wild garden, not necessarily as a woodland. So it's fun to look at it in that capacity. And then here is Oak Bridge after it was removed. This footbridge was called Bank Rock Bridge, and that's because Bank Rock Bay is the name of the water body that sits underneath it. When it was removed, there was a plan to replace the original Oak Bridge, but it never happened. And that's where we come in. So in 2009, the Conservancy, we pretty much reinvented this entire bridge, and that included taking down the existing bridge and then recreating the abutments and rebuilding the historic bridge. Here's some pictures of that restoration. It's pretty incredible to see just how monumental it is. And also you can see those abutments that are right there. There's one just above those gentlemen. And here's another picture of that restoration. Now, we did not use the original building materials that Olmsted and Vaux used. We recognize that white oak and other wood, it's going to deteriorate. And so instead what we did is we used steel, aluminum, and then we painted it to look like wood. Another example of how we're modernizing Central Park, but also staying true to the original aesthetic and the original vision of Olmsted and Fox. Okay. So one last pole, and then one last arch, excuse me. We saw a lot of them, and we moved very quickly through them. And so I'd love to hear which one you connected to most. It could be which is your favorite to visit today. It could be which is the most interesting that you saw today, something that you learned. If there's a bridge that's not in this program and you want to comment and say that that's your favorite in the chat, you're more than welcome to do so as well. All right, now as we end our tour, I want you to think about your favorite bridge or arch, and not necessarily one that we saw today, unless your favorite bridge or arch in the whole world is one of the ones that we looked at. Your favorite might not be in Central Park, and I'm curious what makes it special and what materials used and what's the story behind it, and do you actively use it today? In the chat, why don't you go ahead and, if your bridge or arch is not in Central Park, share with us so we can learn a little bit more. I wanted to share my favorite that I live close to. Oh, before we do, that's Oak Bridge. Okay, this humongous arch is the Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Arch that's in Grand Army Plaza in Brooklyn. It sits just in front of the Brooklyn Public Library, and historically it sat right by the reservoir. You can see the big tower in the back of this image. That is a water tower, and the large stone structure actually is a reservoir. And so that's one of the many connections to Central Park, the fact that this arch sits next to a reservoir. But also you have Olmsted and Fox, who were part of the design of this. They were in collaboration with the famous architect Stanford White, and they built it in 1892. Now, today there are statues on this arch, but those came a few years later. And here they are. The statues came in the mid to late 1890s. And another connection to Central Park is that at the unveiling of these statues, one of the speakers was General William Tecumseh Sherman, Union general during the Civil War. And there's a huge gold statue of him in Grand Army Plaza at Central Park. I personally love the statues on it, the allegorical statue of the winged goddess Victory, who sits above. And another connection to Central Park is by the 1970s, this particular arch had fallen into disrepair, and the statue of Victory actually fell out of her chariot and had to be replaced in 1976. Today it's beautiful, and it used to have an observation tower, or excuse me, an observation deck where you could walk through it, but that closed in the 2000s. And it reminds me of Central Park in so many ways. The design, the people, and the feeling that you get when you approach something that's so grand. And I think walking through Central Park, you get this feeling of peace and tranquility. And then you might turn a corner and see this huge arch, or this decorative brickwork, or this beautiful, delicate cast iron, and be transported to a whole nother place. We made it to the end of our program. I hope you enjoyed exploring Central Park's bridges and arches. Although we couldn't be together in person, we did get to travel all the way across the park, and so that's the benefit of virtual programming. I also wanted to thank you for your commitment to Central Park. As members, you are an integral part in the work, and overall, we can't thank you enough. So this ends our program. From the Central Park Conservancy, we're going to say stay safe and be well. Thank you so very much. We hope to see you soon.